Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing plenary of what's been a very, very quick but very enjoyable day. So thank you again for joining us here at the PHA Canada meeting. Very much appreciate everyone's attendance, and I've learned so much today and my heart goes home full. So I'm so happy to be here. By way of introduction, I am Mitesh Thakrar. I'm a pulmonologist or a respirologist, a lung physician from Calgary. I have interests in both pulmonary hypertension. I'm a pulmonary hypertension physician, as well as lung transplantation. And I'm also a board member here at PHA Canada. And I was asked to give this discussion today, looking at the evolution in pulmonary hypertension, and in particular, where are we going? But I actually feel like there's two things I added to the where are we going. First and foremost, I wanted to talk in detail about Canada's evolution in pulmonary hypertension. And I'm going to show you here that Canada has been a world leader, and many of these leaders are in the room here with us today. And I also want to chat a little bit about where we've come from, because I don't think you can understand where we're going unless you've understood where we came from. And so with that, those are my disclosures. I also wanted to just take a quick moment to recognize the fact, and we heard it so elegantly this morning about the lands that we're gathered on today, where we have the privilege of all meeting together. I have the privilege of living, working, playing, and thriving in Calgary, which is in the heart of southern Alberta. And I want to just acknowledge the fact that I live on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 peoples, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Pekainai, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And then the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. So there are three main objectives that I wanted to tackle today. So first and foremost, I wanted to quickly review the current medical classification of pH. And if any of you joined Dr. Mehta's session earlier today, he would have done a much better job of that than I ever will. I want to review some of the current treatments available in pulmonary hypertension today, and this is by no means going to be everything. And I also want to review some of the future directions in pulmonary hypertension. And again, not to be all-encompassing, but I did cherry pick stuff that I think is relevant to those of us that work here in Canada. So we spoke about this earlier when we were in the Mythbusters session, but the typical patient journey in pulmonary hypertension is not a mystery to all of you. You've experienced this firsthand. And it really takes often many years to get to the point of presenting initially with symptoms of breathlessness, and then perhaps worsening symptoms, going back and forth to various physicians, getting various testing done. And sometimes, unfortunately, showing up very, very ill in our emergency rooms or intensive care units. We try not to get to that point, but what I wanted to just highlight here is that the typical journey, we hear it from all of you in the room, we hear it every single time we meet with patients, is this journey took way longer than we wanted it to take. And so meetings like this are a great way for us to get the message out to healthcare teams that may be less familiar with pulmonary hypertension about this space. And it's just a really nice reminder that we hear you and we get the story, and we want to try to make the rest of that journey better for you. So I think, again, before we think about where we're going, let's talk a little bit about where we came from. So when did we first notice that somebody had pulmonary hypertension? When did we find this out? And it turns out that in 1891, there was an autopsy performed, and Ernest von Romberg, who was a physician at the time, demonstrated that there was pulmonary vascular sclerosis, or in plain English, scarring of the arteries inside of the lungs. So we knew about this disease back in the 1890s. And then the first real well thought out report of an actual patient story came in the 1940s with a patient passing away of right heart failure. And then I just learned this weekend from one of my colleagues in Ottawa who described the story of the very first right heart catheterization in 1929. But instead of this physician, Dr. Forsman, doing a right heart catheterization on a patient, he did it on himself. So at least one physician knows what it feels like to get a right heart cath. Thankfully, we got better at doing right heart caths, and two physicians by the name of Swan and Gans developed the Swan-Gans catheter, which is the one that really hasn't changed in 55 years. It's the same catheter that we still use today. And it allows us to make very, very precise measurements of blood pressure and blood flow. We started to meet as a community in pulmonary hypertension dating back to the 1960s. So in 1960, the very, very first, what we call World Symposia in pulmonary hypertension was convened in Geneva. And it was really looking at patients who were struggling with their hearts failing in the context of their lungs failing. It wasn't about PAH as we know it today. Fast forward to the 1973, and in the early 1970s and late 1960s, there was a rash of patients who were developing pulmonary hypertension related to stimulant use, and this convened the second pulmonary hypertension forum in 1973, where we finally started to describe and talk about and think about PAH. It was called primary pulmonary hypertension in those days, but nonetheless, that disease really became a topic of discussion back in 1973, and we've been meeting regularly as a community every 5 years or so to just have these discussions around the world of what are we doing with PH, where are we at today? With our most recent one being last summer in Barcelona, many of us had the privilege of being able to be there, and it was an incredibly exciting meeting to be at to see where things are moving. Again, Dr. Mehta would have described this to some of you in his breakout session earlier today, but we break pulmonary hypertension down into 5 groups. And I think what's really, really important to remember is that PHA Canada is here for all 5 groups of pulmonary hypertension, right? We focus a lot of our time and discussions on PAH, which is group 1 disease, but we're here for all the different types of pulmonary hypertension. So I want to take some time to remind folks that PAH is a disease of the small little arteries in the lungs, what we call our arterioles. It's rare. This is the zebra as opposed to the horses when you hear the hoofbeats. It's a tough disease to find, and it's a tough disease to manage and a tough disease to live with. But pulmonary hypertension is actually not that uncommon. And very, very commonly, we see pulmonary hypertension associated with the left heart not working properly. We call that group 2 disease. We also can see pulmonary hypertension in folks who develop lung diseases of other sorts, and then the damage gets passed down into the pulmonary arteries, and then the pulmonary arteries struggle as a result of that, and ultimately the heart struggles as a result of that. So we call that group 3 disease, which is associated with lung disease. And then commonly we encounter a lot of chronic blood clots or other chronic obstructions in our pulmonary arteries. And that's what we call group 4 disease. Many of you will have heard of terms like CTEPH and CTED along your journeys. And that's what we're talking about, is in that group 4. And group 5, unfortunately, is the forgotten category where there's, through various mechanisms that we often don't fully understand, there are systemic diseases that can then injure the lung arteries. And we call that group 5 disease, and it's kind of a smattering of things. This slide is really interesting because if you go through our literature before, we would show you a slide that showed 3 really nice pathways that are well thought out. You'll see something called the nitric oxide pathway, the endothelin pathway, and the prostacyclin pathway. And that's what has been in our seminal papers forever and a day. And what's really interesting about this slide is all the molecules on this slide, all the little the rectangles represent new targets. So we've done what we've done, and these are new targets that we're looking at in pulmonary hypertension. So the research keeps happening. These are molecules that we're looking at in various groups of pulmonary hypertension as well. So we're not limiting ourselves to thinking about group 1 disease anymore. We're talking about how can we use medications to work on other targets and other diseases. We've come a long way with medications. This was spoken about many times today, but if you look at the journey of how we get medications from the bench to the bedside and then ultimately into a patient, one of the things we have to do is we have to perform what are called seminal trials. So these are big studies looking at trying to decide, does the drug work and is it safe? And these are the list of what we call phase 3 studies or seminal trials that get these drugs approved for the market space. And the very first medication that was approved was IV epoprostenol back in 1995. And you can see in 30 years how many trials have been done. And I'll tell you, there's probably outside of, I don't know, general cardiology, there's not a lot of disease spaces that would have this many well done, well thought out clinical trials. So for a rare disease space, this is absolutely incredible. One of the trials that really changed the way we practice over the last number of years was this study called the Ambition study, and many Canadian centers were part of the Ambition trial, ourselves included in Calgary. And the Ambition trial basically told us that if you put somebody on double therapy right from the off, right when they get diagnosed with PAH, they do better than if you were on a single agent. So the graph on the right basically tells you how many patients are remaining free of an event being worsening of their disease. And so you can see that the patients with combination therapy, or the black line, have less events over time as compared to those that are on a single drug. And so this really changed the way we practice. Dr. Mielniczuk was saying it earlier today that 15 years ago, we had one drug was all patients could get, and you had to beg and plead and sell your firstborn child to get the second for a patient. And now this is standard of care around the world. And of course, we've all spoken about sotatercept this weekend, and we've now got a fourth pathway for the treatment of pulmonary hypertension or pulmonary arterial hypertension. And this medication was just approved this year by Health Canada, and we're in the process of trying to make this accessible for patients across the country. But again, in a patient population that has had disease for a long time, we were able to demonstrate, and again, many Canadian centers were part of this trial, we were able to demonstrate that you could improve how far people walked, what their 6-minute walk distance went. And that correlates with how they feel and how they do in long-term results as well. And in fact, we went one step further with sotatercept, and this has never really been done in the pulmonary hypertension space, as we looked at our sickest of the sick patients. And what we were able to demonstrate, and again, Canadian centers part of this trial, what we were able to demonstrate is that if you were on sotatercept, you were much, much more likely to do well, about 78% more likely to not have an event. And these were the sickest patients that we saw. And in fact, this trial was stopped with only half of the events recorded because it was deemed to be so good of a treatment that it was unethical to continue to not offer sotatercept to those that were getting placebo in the trial. So that's group 1. So those are just 2 landmark papers. As I said, you saw that graph. There was many that have been done. We're not going to go through them all. We'd be here till next week. We'll shift gears and talk a little bit about group 2 pulmonary hypertension. So group 2 pulmonary hypertension, as I said, is a disease where the pressure rises inside of the lungs because of damage to the left heart. And when the left heart is not receiving blood as efficiently as it should, that pressure backs up into the lungs. And we start to see changes, in particular in the veins, the tiny little vessels that take blood from the capillaries, which is where the air exchange happens, and starts returning blood back to the heart. Those vessels are the ones we start to see damaged. And this is a pathology slide that would tell you that. But you'll have to trust me when I say the disease and the damage is in the veins and looks very akin to other types of damages in the veins that we can see with other more rare forms of pulmonary hypertension. And when I started in practice, we used to tell people that, unfortunately, this is group 2 disease. We don't have good treatment for you. We'll try some Lasix. We'll try, low sodium diets. And unfortunately, you have to kind of struggle through this. And over the last few years, we've had a few different medications come to the front, and in particular, a group of medications called SGLT2 inhibitors, which there's 2 trials there that demonstrate significant improvement, as well as this medication that many of you will have heard of called Ozempic. So Ozempic has been studied in this disease space and is shown to be very effective. And so the point of this slide is just to demonstrate that this other form of pulmonary hypertension requires other forms of therapy. So we can't use the same drugs that we do in the 2 disease spaces, but we are making inroads in all of these different spaces of pulmonary hypertension. Group 3 pulmonary hypertension is like I said, was the disease where damage to the arteries ensues because of usually low oxygen levels or destruction of the arteries from the underlying lung disease that somebody carries. Oops. And what we know is if that ensues, that these patients do struggle and unfortunately don't do as well. And so we really are desperately looking for ways to treat group 3 pulmonary hypertension. And very recently, in the last few years, we've found a medication that we repurposed actually from the PAH space called treprostinil. So some of you are on subcutaneous Remodulin, which is treprostinil. But we found that if you delivered that via an inhaler and put it straight into the lungs, you actually can help people feel better with group 3 disease. And that's never been shown before until 2021. And in fact, if you look at patients who received inhaled treprostinil, they lived longer than if you didn't receive inhaled treprostinil in that space. So again, group 3 disease, we're starting to make some headways here as well. Group 4 disease, some of you in the room might have a diagnosis called CTEPH. And for the longest time in CTEPH, what we did is we had a surgeon go in and take the clots out. And it's a very, very effective therapy. It cures the disease in many patients. But more recently, we've learned that you can slide little balloons into blocked arteries. And if you can slide a balloon into that blocked artery and squish the clot material out of the way, you can improve blood flow. And if you can improve blood flow, people feel better. And in fact, this table demonstrates that patients have a significant improvement in their ability to exercise and improves this marker of how stretched out the heart is called the NT-proBNP. And so we can see that we can help patients almost as well with these balloon tests or balloon procedures as with surgery in many cases. So where are we going? So I've shown you where we've come from. I show you what we have. Where are we going next? And so one molecule that, again, some of us are looking at and being part of the trials is a molecule called seralutinib. There's a story in pulmonary hypertension that's evolving, and sotatercept is helping evolve that story, which is we used to think of the vessels as just simply being constricted. And if you could relieve that pressure, if you could dilate those arteries, they'll work better. But what we're learning more and more is at the actual biologic level is some of these arteries are just getting scarred down. There's stuff growing inside of the arteries. And kind of like cancer, you have stuff growing that you don't want growing. You have to figure out how to stop that from growing. And so there are molecules called tyrosine kinase inhibitors and others that help stop that stuff from growing. And that's what seralutinib proposes to do. And in fact, there was a small study performed using this medication, again, an inhaled medication, that demonstrated a significant reduction in the resistance or the resistance to flow in the arteries. And so that's informed the development and design of this study called the PROSERA study, which is just recently finished recruitment and is in the process of collecting data. And again, Canadian centers have been involved in the PROSERA study. So we're eagerly awaiting to see what that shows us and, what can we learn from that study. This is probably my favorite study, and I have to give a shout out to Dr. Mielniczuk in the audience and my colleague, Dr. Weatherald, who graciously supplied me with his slides. This is a Canadian invention, and I think this is a fantastic idea, and I'm so excited that we get to be part of it in Calgary. So this is the CRAVE study, or the Canadian Right Ventricular Failure Adaptive Trial. And this is really exciting because PHA was involved with how this got off the ground. So the story behind this is Dr. Weatherald and others around the country, and Nicole was part of it as well, led a team of researchers to ask the question of all of us that live and breathe and experience PH, whether you were a healthcare provider, a care provider, a patient, what's important to you in pulmonary hypertension? What do you want us to do? And what they showed was that the number 4 and number 5 priorities around Canada for all of us as team members was to talk about what are the mechanisms of right heart adaptation to pulmonary hypertension and right heart failure, and which interventions or treatment strategies result in the best outcomes for patients with PH. So this is what all of us decided were our priorities number 4 and 5. And so Dr. Weatherald and Dr. Mielniczuk ran with that and said, well, how can we do this? How can we answer these questions for all of us? And so they created a very new trial design called, well, they didn't create it, but they're adapting a trial design called an adaptive platform trial. Most trials will ask the question of, does drug A work better than placebo B? And I'm going to have to find hundreds of patients, and I'm going to have to expose them to drug A or placebo B. What an adaptive platform trial does is it says, well, maybe there's many different medications that we're wondering about, and we can use the same placebo group to compare it to all of those drugs. And maybe halfway through the trial, we find out that a drug is so good that it's going to work. We don't need to keep studying that. We can just move that. We can graduate that drug into standard of care. Or maybe we find a drug that halfway through the trial, we know is not going to work. Well, we can take that out. And so it allows us to be more nimble. It allows us to have more drugs studied for the same cost. And so what they've proposed to do is to use this platform trial and look at 2 medications that are already being used in other spaces in medicine called ranolazine and empagliflozin. And we're going to measure all these different outcomes. The outcomes are going to be things that are important to us, like hemodynamics and 6-minute walk tests and BNP and how you feel on this medication. And then we're going to look at this and we're going to say, could we do this type of trial in Canada and around the world? And if we could, can we scale this up to make this an international study? So there are 5 sites that are going to participate here in the country. And then we're hoping to scale that up to an international study in the years to come. And somebody was asking earlier today about why does it take so long to get a drug into a patient as an approved therapy? And I'll tell you, this concept has been 3 years in the making, and we're not even quite up and running fully yet. So Dr. Weatherald and Dr. Mielniczuk had this idea back in 2022 after speaking to all of us as to what was important. And you can see along the way, there's all these different steps that they had to take in order to get this trial where we want. And we're almost there. We're, 3 more stops till we're at the end of this little trial. And this is the start of the next big trial. So we're not even, the finish line's a long way away. But this just gives us a sense of all these different steps that these investigators have to undertake in order to get us there. And again, this trial has in part been supported by PHA Canada. In the group 2 space, and I think Dr. Langleben's part of the steering committee for this trial, is the Cadence trial, which is to look at sotatercept in group 2 pulmonary hypertension. And so we're waiting for the data for that to come out. I think it's finished recruiting just recently. There are Canadian sites that are also part of this study, looking at another inhaled medication called mosliciguat, somewhat related to riociguat, with the goal of it trying to increase nitric oxide or a vasodilator in the lungs. And this is being looked at in group 3 disease. So in those with scarring of the lungs called interstitial lung disease and pulmonary hypertension. And again, there are Canadian sites that are recruiting for this trial as well. In the CTEPH space, in the group 4 space, I couldn't find a Canadian trial. Unfortunately, I don't think we have anything quite this elegant, but there's a trial being run out of Europe that's asking the very question that many of us have had, which is a balloon as good as surgery, or which one's better? And so this is a trial that's being run out of the Netherlands, looking at comparing balloons versus surgery for CTEPH. I just think this is an absolute mouthful of a sentence, so I want to read it out. But this is an investigator-initiated, multi-center, prospective, randomized, controlled, open-label, non-inferiority trial. I don't know how many adjectives you could have put into that sentence, but there's probably not very many left. So what that means is investigator-initiated means some of us, physicians, professors, said, we're going to do this. They decided to do this. So this is not being sponsored by an industry partner. This is done out of grant money that they may have gotten from their national granting agency. Multi-center, as the name implies, is done at more than one hospital. Prospective means we're not going to look at what happened to patients in the past. Let's not look at our past experience, but let's move forward and look at patients as they come. And the reason we do that is when you look at things that happened in the past, you're not always privy to the decision-making as to why somebody got a therapy or didn't get a therapy. And so this allows you to understand that decision-making. Randomized means you don't get to choose which therapy you get. You either get BPA, the balloon, or you get surgery, but you don't get to choose. It's going to be randomly given to you. Controlled means we have one group getting one therapy and one getting the other, and you don't get to cross over. You don't get both. In this case, this is what we call open label. Many of ours are blinded studies. So if you're in a pharmacology study, you might be in a blinded study, which means your investigator, your research coordinator, your nurse, you as a patient don't know what you're getting. In this case, you can't really blind your surgeon to doing a surgery. That wouldn't go well. So it has to be open. They have to know if they're doing surgery, or they have to know if they're giving you a balloon. Non-inferiority means we're going to compare the two and we're going to say, is one, let's make sure treatment A, BPA, is not worse than doing surgery. So it's a bit of a different than saying it's superior. You have to do a different type of statistical methodology. But yeah, this basically in one sentence, for those of us that do research, would understand exactly the trial design that they're trying to get to. And I think this is really, really exciting because they're actually going to look at and see whether balloons are as good as surgery. We're about 40 years behind the cardiologists who have shown that balloons work really well in coronary arteries. And I want to leave you with a little bit of hope because this is where we're going. So there's a web page called clinicaltrials.gov. If you're ever curious about what's going on with research in the world, clinicaltrials.gov is where all of us register all of our research studies. And if you just type in pulmonary hypertension in clinicaltrials.gov, there's 1,884 studies ongoing. So that's how much research is being done. So when people ask, is somebody asking question X or question Y? Probably they are, because there's 1,800 studies being done right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on my colleagues because I'm not smart enough to answer this question, but they are. So I'm going to call on 3 colleagues to join me up here. And I'm going to ask them to think about the question of, in the next 5 years, what do you think will be the most exciting developments in pulmonary hypertension? So by way of introduction, I'm going to start with Dr. John Granton. Dr. Granton is a friend and colleague who lives here in Toronto. He is a professor of medicine, and he does both, I think he does critical care, transplant, and pulmonary hypertension. He actually established the pulmonary hypertension program here at UHN in 1997. So John, thank you. And then I'm going to introduce Dr. David Langleben. Dr. Langleben is a professor at McGill University. He was the former chief of cardiology there as well. He is an absolute world expert and a legend in pulmonary hypertension. And I have learned so much from Dr. Langleben, and I welcome him to the floor. And then last, but certainly not least, Dr. Lisa Mielniczuk. Dr. Mielniczuk works in Ottawa, used to work in Ottawa, and then she left us for the United States. So now she works at the Mayo Clinic. But Dr. Mielniczuk is a professor of cardiology at Mayo Clinic. She is a board member as well here at PHA Canada. She developed and co-founded the Ottawa Pulmonary Hypertension Program, and was previously the vice chair of the Canadian Heart Failure Society. So Dr. Mielniczuk as well, please. I don't know. Do we have a mic? Oh, there we are. Right. Let's. Back. Okay. So I'm gonna have a seat too because I don't feel like standing. But I'll let you guys answer the question.
One famous trick is to try to sit as far away from the podium speaker as possible. Didn't work. Okay. Good afternoon. Well, 5 years. 5 years seems like a long time, but it's actually a really short time. And probably almost anything that's going to happen in the next 5 years is, in my view, already underway. You heard Dr. Thakrar show you that there are a huge number of trials that are underway. So we really have the hope of being able to test for other therapies. And remember, that doesn't mean in a 5-year window that they're going to get approved, even if they're very good. Some will be good, some won't be good. I can think of 3 trials recently that either didn't work or in some ways were harmful. There's no guarantee until we actually do the trials. So first of all, the most exciting thing to me is, I hope, the final approval of sotatercept and easy availability. Easy availability. We're in a healthcare system that's supposed to take care of us, and to not have access to medications that are very good and excellent and novel and as I said in a session earlier, you know, the improvements come as a staircase, okay? And sometimes there's a while, and sometimes there's a really big step, not that's difficult to climb, but that brings you up to a whole other very high level. And that's what I'm looking forward to this year and in coming years. But there will be other agents. There's no medication that we have that works for everyone. And if I look at cancer therapy, and there are a lot of parallels. If I look at cancer therapy, most people aren't on one good agent. They're on several good agents. The other big advent, and I hope it's going to come in 5 years, but I don't know, is the recognition that although we're all in this room together, the problem of PH is slightly different in each of us. It's like saying someone has lung cancer or breast cancer. Well, that's great, okay? But we know now that there are different kinds of breast cancer and different kinds of lung cancer. And some of those need treatment A and some of those need treatment B. And that's called precision medicine and individualized medicine. And we're trying to do that more and more, but so far, we don't have enough understanding of the cells and what goes wrong in an individual to look and say, oh, you have marker A, we need to give you treatment A. You have marker B, we need to give you treatment B. We haven't been very good at looking back at our studies, and every study, fortunately, has winners, and unfortunately, has some people who don't respond. And really trying to understand who wins and who doesn't respond, because we can hopefully find something else for the people who don't respond. But we need to know why those people are different, and we don't understand that yet. I'm going to pass this on because there's lots more to say, I hope.
Yeah, thanks, David. 5 years is a short period of time. Maybe I'll take the prerogative to kind of say 5 to 10 years, because I think David's right. I think that the life cycle of clinical research is it takes a few years just to get an interesting idea out there to the public to study and test the hypothesis. And so there's probably lots going on that that are in that 5 to 10 year window that are worth talking about. I think I would like to build a little bit. There's so many things to say. It's hard to just narrow it down. So I'm going to build a little bit on what David was just talking about, because I do think that this is a very exciting opportunity, which of course we're all excited about the drugs, but I'm also very excited about the concept of how we use the drugs. Exactly this concept of personalization of medicine. Right now, the way we treat our patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension is what we call a risk-based algorithm. So when you come to our clinic, we do a number of different parameters. We ask you questions, we do blood work, we subject you to all kinds of things that you may or may not like. And the reason we're doing that is we try to understand what your level of risk is in terms of being able to make decisions, because we want everyone to feel well. We want everyone to be in what we call a low risk status. And our guidelines and the literature and everything we've learned about says that if you are not meeting your treatment goals, our treatment goals for you, that we should be escalating or changing your therapy. And that sounds fantastic, but that's where it ends, right? We don't actually know really what that means, other than if you're on drug A and B, maybe we add drug C. Or if you're on drug A, B, and C, we add drug D. Or maybe we take away drug C and we add drug F. There's not a lot of precision to that management. And so what's happening is, 4 drugs may be better than 3, 3 drugs may be better than 2, certainly 2 is better than 1. But just as David was saying, it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment. We don't think it is. Cancer treatment has taught us that, as David has said. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in, and this is already being done, is how do we integrate all of those pieces of information that we do every time you come into clinic to be able to understand how we should modify, or if we should modify, your treatment regimen. And we talked a little bit about this in the Mythbusters, and this is some of the new work that I'm moving into, which is to be able to use things like machine learning and large data analytics to be able to see things much greater than I could, or John maybe John and David could. Let's be honest, these guys, I've learned everything I know about pH from the people sitting up here with me, but in general, there's too much data for us to be able to understand with one brain or 2 brains. And so how can we understand this more? How can artificial intelligence help us to be able to personalize what we should do beyond just a simple red, yellow, green of risk assessment? And I think that that is coming. And I think that maybe 5 years is a bit premature, but 5 to 10 years, I'm hopeful that we will understand much better about what drugs we should be using with which patient, based on information that we can integrate at that point that we are not able to integrate right now.
Doesn't leave me very much to talk about. No, those are excellent points. I think I'd say what I hope for. I certainly would hope for finding something, but I agree that the turnaround is so long to bring an idea to fruition. And I think what we're learning, though, is the way we do trials. You showed a very long worded trial, but these platform trials that we're doing, and a platform basically is the way we used to do trials is much like you would have if you think of it like a sport, a football game or a soccer game or whatever. Every time you wanted to play a game, you had to build a brand new stadium and play the game there, tear it down, move it somewhere else, different game, build a new stadium and play the game there, tear it down, move it somewhere else. And that's how we do trials. We basically decide on what game we're going to play. We build a stadium, we play the game, we tear the stadium down and move next. But our platform is much like we have stadiums that stay there, and we can actually do a whole bunch of different games there. We can play different sports on there. It's the same stadium. And so it allows for much faster throughput of moving drugs and ideas, and even non-drug therapies, which are critically important in treating people. and to evaluate which ones are going to be winners and which ones are going to be losers very quickly. And so you can adapt and make these kinds of very creative changes. And we saw this, we learned from COVID, where the whole world's attention and we were singularly focused, and there was a huge level of collaboration, cooperation across nations to develop therapies to successfully treat COVID. And if you think of deadly diseases that have basically received a treatment which is very effective, excepting there are certainly side effects associated with that. But for most people, you think of how fast that happened, right? Like that's unprecedented. That just doesn't happen. And so that kind of laser sharp focus in a very creative way of doing trials and bringing an idea or construct to the bedside and to start using in people, that just never happened. Like it's never happened. So, and again, I think it was just stuff got done. And I actually, oddly, kind of like that time because stuff got done. And I think that's what we need to do as a scientific community. And that's where your stuff, I think, intersects that by being advocates just to get stuff done. And I think that's where we need to land.
Yeah, no, I get to ask the questions. I don't have to answer them. Well, I guess I can give you my 2 cents. You know, I totally agree that I think, you know, novel ways of doing trials is really exciting. I actually think too that we ask the question, and I'm just as guilty. I presented lots of different medications and drugs, but I think the other thing that we've learned over the last few years, and again, shout out to Dr. Weatherald et al., who, you know, really put it front and center to say, we need to know what we should be studying, and we need to know what's important to patients. And we've done, I think, a better job of that over the last 5 years. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be doing an even better job of that. And so I'm looking forward to the days where we have patients and families front and center of our research projects, sitting on our research development from day one. And I think having patients involved, perhaps even in non-pharmacology trials, right, and in other interventions, is where this space is headed. And I look forward to more of that. And in fact, I'm going to ask you the question because it's burning on my mind is, can you guys think of other ways in which patients could get involved with research that may not necessarily be, you know, a pharmaceutical trial of drug X versus drug Y?
Yes, we go back this way. So, okay. Well, I think this is an opportunity, just these conversations, I think asking people what they want and where they are challenged in their day-to-day and getting their perspective. The best questions I always find is when I'm doing rounds and having conversations with people and listening, and you kind of think, gee, that's a really good question. I never thought of that before. So I think asking questions and having those discussions with your care providers is really important. And often that will stimulate an idea because we weren't really aware of that problem, or it was kind of a cool observation. We kind of twigs you a little bit and you say, gee, I never really thought of that. And let's look into that. So I think, you know, having those conversations. And I think the non-pharma stuff is critically important as well. So I would say that you guys voicing the need to address certain aspects of your lives that we're not addressing, the psychosocial, the spiritual, the physical, the disability, the challenges for your families that you face, and how can we improve upon that? That's research, is looking at strategies which would help more people. It's not always through medication, it's through other things, which are often as good as or better than many of the therapies that we're using. So I think that's one way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you did. I think you did say it all. I think it's a really important question, and I know it's a priority for PHA Canada. to help to build these partnerships. And, you know, we've thought a lot about that in the last few years, as Mitesh has said, and really at every stage of project design and study design, there is an incredible opportunity for partnership with people with lived experience and their caregivers, telling us, you know, what's important to you, telling us how you would want or not want to participate in a study, and telling us what makes sense for you in the translation of that study result, whatever that result is. You know, what messages are important, and what are, you know, how should we spread that message? How should we communicate that message? Every single step of from an idea in our head to a publication printed, to the dissemination of research in medical conferences, we can't do it without patient partnership, and we've learned that. And so I'm really excited. I think Canada leads this, quite honestly, this initiative. And I think PHA Canada in particular has demonstrated leadership within Canada in this role. And a lot of that has to do with the people sitting right here in the room, with the staff and with the community at PHA Canada. So, you know, we've been talking about how we can disseminate our learnings to other organizations, because I think what is being done here is so fantastic. And even that is exciting to think about. So it's a great question.
So I guess I'm going to go back to when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was a junior clinician. But I distinctly remember a very early Pulmonary Hypertension Association meeting in the United States, the first one I'd ever gone to, the second one that was ever held. And something remarkable was happening there, because at the time, people were looking for a gene that might cause, a gene mutation that might cause pulmonary hypertension. And I remember every patient in that room coming to give a blood sample voluntarily to give the particular researchers enough information to be able to tease out whether there was a real gene, whether there wasn't a real gene, and begin to understand what the gene was. One of the things we're lacking worldwide are what we would call extensive biobanks, which are collections of blood, sometimes of tissue, that allows scientists to ask a question and begin to study it in populations. And we've actually the other day talked about, you know, there are several small biobanks in Canada, but really establishing a national biobank. And the only way to establish a biobank is to have the people who are unfortunately suffering from the illness donate the blood, and also have their disease very well characterized, so that we know, you know, not everyone's, just as not everyone the same in this room is the same in terms of their illness. Very carefully, what we call phenotyped. Okay, so that when a researcher says, "Oh, I need samples from patients that have this particular profile to study to look for a certain problem." This is, by the way, how the breast cancer and lung cancer and all the other illnesses sorted out what genes were wrong. People were donating biopsy samples, tissue samples, whatever. And so I'd like in the next 5 years to see a very large national biobank. It's expensive. There are ethical issues, but biobanks do run very successfully and very effectively, and we should be setting that up. And so my view, in addition to all the stuff and really understanding what all of your journeys are, and helping prioritize on the basis of that, is to really try to get more fundamentally into disease, to try to find more treatments for you.
But I think we have a little bit of time, and it would be a bit hypocritical to not allow patients to ask questions. So I would very much love to hear, you know, what are some of the burning thoughts that are on the minds of patients, and we can try and answer them. Again, this is not to answer medical issues or medical concerns, but really more focused around what your thoughts, beliefs, questions are about research and where we're heading in the pulmonary hypertension space over the next 5 years and maybe 10 years.
I think thank you all for the illumination on research and clinical trials. I have a question for Dr. Mielniczuk. And you mentioned briefly machine learning. Does AI really shorten any of your tasks in clinical trials?
Yeah. So the whole idea of machine learning and AI is a very big umbrella term, and it may mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so, I want to be careful in my response. I can tell you that there are absolute opportunities to integrate artificial intelligence in our clinical decision making and our clinical care of patients. I can give you some examples that are used quite regularly across many centers. One is we spend an inordinate amount of time, what we call non-clinical time. Before we even see a new patient, we have to review all of the medical records that patient comes with. And there can be many, many documents that need to be reviewed and understood so that when we meet you, your time is efficient and we have a good understanding of your journey. That takes a long time to do. There are ways that our medical electronic health record can help us to integrate very quickly some of that information for us so that we, A, make sure we don't miss anything, and B, it is more efficient and time saving, which provides us with more time available to spend with the patient. So that's one example. Another example is AI can be used in helping us to document the clinic visit. So another big non-piece of clinical time that we do is documenting, writing a letter. Every time we see you, we document everything we can in that encounter. So there is a medical record there and a way to communicate with each other. This is not something I do regularly, but there are many places that are being done where you can actually use AI to help to draft that letter, help to record the transcript of the conversation, and then be able to produce a document that saves time. So some of this is time saving. It's only one of many possible ways where we are currently using artificial intelligence in our clinical practice. Beyond that sort of time-saving efficiency, there are certainly opportunities to use AI to help us with our clinical decision-making, right? So there's a lot of complexity in the decisions that we make, and sometimes we know it all, and many times we don't know it all. And we can use infrastructure to help us with real-time decision-making. These are all just tiny little things that I think enhance both the quality and the care that we can provide to our patients when we see them. And this is just in clinical care, right? This is if you talk about research and teaching, that's a whole nother opportunity for us to harness some of the power of data.
Yeah, with regard to that, in basic research, like I said, if you have a biobank, you're trying to find something, one molecule or several molecules that will identify a group of people, that will identify a particular disease process. There are a zillion molecules to check, and AI is superb at handling masses of data and finding the commonalities and finding the differences and presenting them to the person who's looking at it in a much more simple way that they can then think about. And so AI is already being used in that way, and it's central now. It's critical.
We've got a question from Réjean, who's online, and would like to know if you can say anything about sotatercept research.
So there's a ton of sotatercept research. First of all, the clinical studies, the major clinical studies have been done, but there are many, many clinical subgroups that are yet to be examined. Now, whether they'll be examined as a part of pharmacy industry clinical trials versus groups of physicians that get together and say, you know what, we should really study this particular issue in a group of patients. That remains to be determined. But there are many, many different questions around timing, dosing, follow-up, concomitant agents, including new agents that haven't been approved yet. How are they going to work together? So there's a ton of research to be done, as there is with any new medication that comes out, and it will be done. But again, it takes time to publish. And so in a 5-year window, there will be quite a bit. By a 10-year window, there will be a lot more.
I guess for me, again, it comes back to the precision medicine stuff, is knowing who's going to respond to that drug versus who isn't, and not waste people's time being exposed to something that's not going to work. And we know, and I don't mean to be discouraging, but I think people need to understand this isn't the silver bullet for everybody. So it's going to work for some of you, and it's going to work really well. But for a significant percentage, it's not still, which is unfortunate, which again spurs the need to look for new treatments. And I think, again, the treatment of lung cancer in particular, there's if we use a particular type of therapy to treat all forms of lung cancer, we wouldn't be able to tell it worked. But yet there'd be about 10% of patients, or 15% we noticed, had really good response, and they have a particular type of marker in their lung cancer. And now we're focusing treatments towards that particular type of receptor of lung cancer, and they do extremely well, but you can't apply it to all lung cancer. So I guess for me, I know there's a lot of hope for sotatercept, but I think you can't hang your hat on that. We continue to need to evolve and find new treatments for the other people who aren't benefited by sotatercept. And it's not free from side effects either. So I think you have to go into it understanding it's early days yet. We don't know in 5 years from now what sotatercept will have done for some people. So it's early days. And so before you hitch everything to a wagon, you have to, I'm a very strong skeptic about new therapies. And I think you have to really understand that we don't know what 5 years of exposure to this drug looks like, or a few years exposure. It's very early yet. So.
Dr. Thakrar, you had mentioned Ozempic in treatment of PAH. Is that one of the treatments available?
No. So I mentioned Ozempic in the context of group 2 pulmonary hypertension. And, I've got 2 cardiologists sitting to the right of me, so I'm going to be careful with what I say. But there certainly are data within using Ozempic in that form of pulmonary hypertension. A sister compound, or not even sister, but kind of same idea. Ozempic started as a diabetes medication. I presented some data on using a medication called dapagliflozin and empagliflozin in group 2 pulmonary hypertension. Works on a totally different pathway, but again, a diabetes drug that we've seen do remarkable things in helping patients with stiffening of their left heart and in group 2 PH. And in fact, the trial that we're about to start, the CRAVE trial, is going to look at using empagliflozin in group 1 disease. And so we'll see how that goes. But certainly we are looking at repurposing these drugs and seeing where in that circuit and that circulation certain medications might be helpful in one compartment and maybe less so in others, or maybe they're helpful everywhere. And we're trying to learn all of that biology as we go.
From one Jane to the next. I want to know a bit more about women and PH. We see a lot of people in support group and online. Maybe the men are doing other things, but there's a predominant female representation. So has there been studies into the whole women piece in PH is my curiosity.
Yeah. So certainly, we know that women are more likely to get PAH. So if we look at what the traditional person who we saw with PAH, they were born female. They have, for various reasons, a higher predilection to getting the disease. We often described it as a disease that was seen in women of childbearing potential, was what it was always regarded as. What we're seeing, though, is a shift in the way patients are being diagnosed and the types of patients we're seeing. And so we are seeing different, what we call clusters or phenotypes of PAH. So when we thought we had idiopathic PAH figured out and we said, this is a disease of young women, turns out we were wrong. And we are seeing male patients develop PAH, but they tend to be older. They tend to have risk factors for heart disease. It's a very different story. And yet, when you go into the cath lab and you measure their hemodynamics, they look just the same. But the way that those patients respond to therapy is different. Their journey is different. Their entire experience is different, right? And this speaks to what we've been talking about with precision medicine is we're struggling as a community to say, well, why is it that we're seeing these clusters of patients that have very different responses? And can we try to identify what is it about the male patient who's in their mid-60s presenting with IPAH that makes it so that they respond to therapy differently than the female patient who's 35? So there are these different clusters of patients that we see.
The thing we don't see with this disease is you do in others, you don't see clustering in different ethnic groups or background necessarily either. Like there may be some secondary forms of the condition that cluster in Europeans and other areas, but you don't see that clustering, save the occasional toxic exposure and things like that, but you don't see that clustering. So that's kind of unusual. The real sex bias, which we don't understand, we blamed hormonal changes, withdrawal of hormones causing injury to the blood vessels, exposing those risks. But we also know that some hormones can be protective to blood vessels too. So I don't think we really understand the sex linkage in this condition. Yeah, more to be studied. But again, it speaks to David's call for understanding it. And the only way you get to know that is by understanding the biology, which usually requires blood and tissue samples to kind of sort out. Yeah.
Just a quick thing to add, and I think it reflects some of the progress that is being made in the field. Jane, your question is so important, and people really understand how critical this question is and how we need to answer it. And even just 5 or 6 years ago, almost all clinical research starts with what we call preclinical research, which is research on animal models. That's the nature of how science has evolved. And even just 5 or more years ago, all animal models were always only done in male rats or male mice. Typically, most research that comes to our clinical office is done in mouse or rat models. That's just how it evolves for many reasons, which we probably don't have time to go into. But until a few years ago, those studies were only done in male rats, and they did that purposely to keep uniformity, right? They wanted everything to be the same except whatever condition was being changed to understand the clinical question. But now, if you want to do work in this area, you have to do the work in both sexes. And that's, I think, great and fantastic. And if you want to get your work published or validated, you've got to show that you understand the difference in whatever it is you're studying in both animal models. So I think that's really a good evolve. We're getting there. We've got room to go, but we are getting there.
And just to show you how complex it is, if we think about, I think probably the 2 largest causes of PAH, which are the idiopathic heritable group, okay, and the scleroderma group, the connective tissue disease group. Well, we know that autoimmune disease, particularly scleroderma, has a female predominance. We don't know why. And there was at least one study suggesting that in idiopathic, at least the families that have heritable, there are more male miscarriages than females. In other words, there are more females born into the family than males. I haven't seen anything to refute that. But again, more women are being born presumably with this than the males. And that can skew everything and make it think, oh, you know, females are at more risk. It doesn't mean necessarily more risk. There may just be fewer men with it, at least for some of the genetic variants. So it's very interesting. It's very complex.
Another question from online. Angel asks, what is the possible availability of inhaled treprostinil treatments like Tyvaso in Canada, either in an upcoming clinical trial or as a viable alternative to IV and subcutaneous treatments?
That's not a question for us. That's a question for the company. You know, honestly, the way it works in Canada is we can't go forward to Health Canada and say, you know, we've heard about this really great stuff that's come out in Europe, and we really want it. Unless a company is prepared to bring it to Health Canada, and that's a business decision. Unless they're prepared to bring it to Health Canada and get it approved, get it through all the provinces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we may be able to get very rare compassionate access to it, but otherwise we have no access to it. And that really is a corporate decision. We can prevail on the companies, and believe me, we've tried repeatedly to have this available for our patients. And at best, we're listened to. At worst, we're blown off.
You know, I think it's the bigger question, and I think is as a role as a community, advocacy is really important for PHA Canada, and it's becoming increasingly important and demonstrated how our voice makes a difference, and not my voice, your voice, how your voice makes a difference. And that helped us with getting sotatercept reviewed quickly, and it's helped us provincially in Ottawa getting approvals of combination drug therapies. A lot of the work that John's done over the years to get access to our patients. So our voice does matter. Our collective voice matters. And so I think those conversations are important to have. Ultimately, as David said, we don't control making those decisions, but I'd like to hope that we have an influence in making those decisions. And certainly we can raise awareness to disparities when we see disparities. I mean, never mind, that there are disparities between countries on access to therapy. There are disparities between provinces on access to therapies as well. So Tyvaso is one drug, one example, but there are a lot of other examples where there are still challenges in getting drugs to patients in a timely fashion across the country. So these are important questions to have, and important to, you can use PHA Canada and the resources at PHA Canada if you want to be involved, if this is something that you're passionate about, if you feel that you want your voice to be heard. PHA Canada can help you, speak to any staff member, speak to Jamie or to Kim, and they can show you how and help you to be involved in advocacy with current projects we're working on and projects going forward.
And I think there are a lot of questions to be asked. Why does it take longer for a pharmaceutical company to apply for Canadian approval than for US and European approval? Why isn't the application form going in on the same day they're applying to the FDA and to the EMA? Why do they wait until they hear from those agencies sometimes before they apply into Canada? And this does happen. Why is the process from approval to availability so long? Particularly for medications that we feel are vital. And again, we have no control over this. These are government bureaucratic decisions, but an association can go and say, hey, we're not happy with this. We're not happy with this because when FDA approves a medication, it's available. The insurance companies in the States figure out how to pay for it, but by law, it has to be available. Here we have this whole secondary process of provinces deciding how, if, how much, et cetera. And it individualizes across the country. It's not even uniform necessarily. This is something to lobby for. This is something that frustrates us enormously as physicians. I've had patients who could have really used medications rapidly after federal approval, and we don't have access to them for many, 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 many months. And it's the patients that pay the price. And so I think the patients have to be vocal about this and say things got to change. And the only way is to deal with your politicians and lobby.
One last question, if there's one. It's yours.
All right. Joan, are you coming up here? Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me now? I just want to say something, like, I know Jamie should be here. Unfortunately, she still is under the weather. Much of the stuff that our doctors on the stage are mentioning and talking about, PHA Canada is really, really involved in trying to get these medicines. We understand how long the drug development and approval process is here in Canada. And part of our job, which you guys don't see on a regular basis, is advocating. We've asked you to advocate for sotatercept, but we continue to advocate all the time for improvements throughout the drug development, the drug approval process, because it's unreasonably long in this country. And so kudos, thank you very much. I'm sitting here going, I just wish Jamie was here, because Jamie would speak to so much of what we do at PHA Canada. But I am so appreciative of the fact that you guys have brought this up, and to let you guys know, the rest of you, all of the community, that this is something that is really important to us, and we understand it, and we are fighting all the time, every day, to get access to these drugs and improvements to the drug approval process in this country.
My comments weren't in any way intended to be a criticism. Kudos to
Yeah,
PHA
no,
Canada. I know how much you do.
Yeah.
But I think everyone has a voice, and do it through PHA Canada, but be vocal.
Yeah.
That was my encouragement.
No, and I apologize if that sounded like it was a criticism, because it wasn't. The point is, like, I am appreciative of the fact that you guys have brought it up, because if you hadn't, we now wouldn't be having this discussion. We've now educated. It's another opportunity to educate our community on the importance of the fact of how the drug approval process in this country is so meandering and difficult process to get through, but it also, and the role of patients and the community in advocating both for access and for participation in the whole drug development and approval process. So it was just like a thank you actually to you guys for bringing it up and making it real.
And I'm sure you raised this, but everybody has a voice, and you all are voters. So and it's often good advocating for the party that's not in power. So going to your constituent's office that lost the last election and wants to win the next one is a very good strategy. And then you have, and I'm not going to tell you, you can go to your newspapers and raise a voice, and just your communities, and do the work that you're doing, because our voices, we basically, the ministry is tired of hearing from doctors. That we complain constantly about everything. So I think patients' voice coming to the government is very, very powerful. And telling your story, as Crystal did today, is really powerful. And even in the drug approval process, as it goes nationally, the patients have a voice at that table. And that's a very strong voice. When we were talking to the ministry, trying to advocate for medications, having the patient's voice. When there's equivalence of treatments, the patient's voice rose above that, because it speaks to the disease burden and the reality. And ultimately, governments want to help people, but they're faced with crisis too. They have a limited budget, and they want to spend it appropriately for the largest group of people. So I am sympathetic to governments, but they do take a long time to make a decision, and they need a nudge. And I will tell you, politics trumps policy every time. So if you raise your voice and make a lot of noise, you will trump that kind of meandering that governments normally do.
Perfect. Well, I wanted to thank the three of you for joining me up here. It would have been really lonely by myself. So thank you.